Good morning and greetings to everyone at Engaging with the Web Archives. May I take this opportunity to thank Sharon and Michael for all of their efforts in bringing this event together. The attention of contemporary historians like me is now turning to the 1990s, and as a result to the archived web as another type of primary source for the study of the period. This attention is being paid to differing aspects of web history, the technical history of the medium, as well as every kind of cultural, political and economic life that manifested itself online. But there is more to the web than individual objects, and indeed individual sites, though much early work in web history tended to focus at this level. What follows is an exercise in understanding a particular web sphere. Now here I developed Niels Brugger's definition of a web sphere to posit a new distinction between hard and soft web spheres, defined in terms of the ease with which their boundaries may be drawn, and the rate at which those boundaries change over time. Examples of hard web spheres might be, for instance, the websites of the individual members of the European Parliament, or of the football clubs in the English Premier League. Given the clarity with which these particular definitions can be drawn, and their stability, 5 years for MEPs, 1 year for the Premier League, the work in isolating a hard web sphere and its archival traces is relatively light. The study of soft web spheres, however, presents additional difficulties, since the definition of topics or themes is more difficult if they're not expressed in institutional terms. The definition of European politics may be contested in ways that membership of the European Parliament may not. This paper, then, is a case study in the reconstruction of just such a soft web sphere, much of which is lost from the live web and exists only in the Internet Archive. Scholars of conservative Christianity have known for many years of various historic correlations between conservatism in doctrine and particular stances on a number of key political, legal and ethical issues. In the 1990s in the UK, certain issues were particularly prominent. Moves towards recognition in law of same-sex partnerships, the law on abortion, on assisted suicide and on therapeutic cloning. Scholars have also examined Christian attitudes in the UK to the European Union and to concerns about the place of Islam in public life. Less obvious, both in the media and popular consciousness, was the engagement of conservative Protestants in particular with issues of biblical interpretation that have cultural consequences. Creationism and its place, if any, in science education and public broadcasting, or the interpretation of biblical prophecy in relation to current politics, including the Middle East and climate change. The period from the mid-1990s was given a particular sharpness by the approach of the year 2000. The projected catastrophe of the Y2K bug was itself a subject of prophetic speculation, but there was no shortage of other material in world politics to fuel the reflection of Christian Zionists in particular, who were already, as it were, semiotically aroused, capped off, of course, by the events of 9/11. Before the widespread adoption of the web, conservative Christian anxiety in the UK about these issues was often expressed by and through various parachurch organisations, Christian in ethos and leadership, but functionally independent of the churches themselves. The Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child was just such an organisation, and one of the oldest. Before the web, these organisations tended to communicate by means of events and public speaking, video and audio cassette distribution, and ephemeral literature. All of these were poorly archived and are now very hard to recover. The web, as it lowered the barriers to entry to public discussion, not only gave old and newly formed groups alike a novel means of communication, but also allowed individuals to add their voices to the chorus. The archived web affords an opportunity to ask two particular questions that were previously difficult, if not impossible, to answer. Firstly, though each of these disputes has been observed singly, how far did the same individuals or groups engage with several or all of them as a package? Was the engagement with this particular cluster of issues a function of something more fundamental in theology and practice? Or alternatively, did conservative British Christians engage with single issues on their own merits, rather than as a part of a set of common concerns? An examination of the link relationships in the archived web affords one way of approaching this question. To what degree were the parts of the conservative Christian web that addressed each individual issue connected with each other by links? Did they together constitute a meaningful web sphere for analysis? Secondly, the same data can also be used to investigate the extent to which the web allowed an internationalization of religious interchange. Christians in the UK had for many decades been in dialogue with fellow believers in the USA, but were limited by the cost of travel and of importing print and other material. The web allowed readers and publishers alike in the UK to access material from other countries that previously would have been difficult, if not impossible, to obtain. How, if at all, is such an internationalization to be identified and analysed? Was there, in fact, an Anglo-American conservative Christian web sphere? How then to recover the sound of this chorus of voices in order to address these two questions? The historian of the late 1990s must deal with a problem which has several layers. Firstly, the vast bulk of content from the period is no longer on the live web. We know this. Secondly, and rather more seriously, we have few indications of what has been lost. No inventory of the 1990s web against which to check the archive for completeness. And thirdly, of the content that was captured by the Internet Archive, more or less the only archive of the Anglophone web of the period, only a superficial layer is exposed to full-text search, and the bulk may only be retrieved by a search for the URL. So not only do we not know what was never archived, among the content that was captured it's difficult to find what we might want, since there's no means of knowing in advance the URL of a lost resource. To use an analogy from an archival context, there is a finding aid here, but one with only class marks and no descriptions, or if you prefer, a library catalogue, which contains only ISBN numbers, when the ISBN registry itself is not available to us. Scholars require then some means of understanding the archived web, using only the data that it can be made to disclose about itself. In the remainder of this paper I outline a method of web sphere reconstruction based not on page content, but on the relationships between sites, i.e. the web of hyperlinks that forms part of the archive. It is an elaboration of 3 studies of my own, looking at smaller and less complex web spheres, one hard and 2 soft. And the method is iterative in nature and involves both computational interrogation of large data sets and the close examination of individual archive pages, as well as printed and other non-digital sources. The first stage was to establish an initial list of domains of the conservative Christian organisations in question, and this was derived from several sources. The first was the live web, since many of the campaigning organisations that were active in the late 90s still exist. The second source was the body of scholarly research on the subject published during the period under examination. In the case of the religious web, there was a significant body of pioneering early work in the late 90s by Internet and religious studies scholars. However, this work is now cut adrift from the matters it describes, as the materials that it analysed no longer exist, and the research created no research data as such. For example, the 2001 study To Give Me That Online Religion by Brenda E. Brasher carried the disclaimer that, quote, "We know that many of the websites listed in this book no longer exist," and so referred readers instead to Brasher's own website for a list of the current sites. But that site also no longer exists, and itself was only partially archived. It was possible then to derive additional relevant domains from a review of this early published scholarship on online religion. Those of you over a certain age will remember a time when publishers rushed to issue printed books that guided surfers to the best of the web, like this one. Some domains were derived from this and similar books, but even at the time it was clear that such printed accounts would very soon fall out of date. And so readers could also turn to sites such as Yahoo, which was listing thousands of religious websites as early as 1996, and the Open Directory project. And the Internet Archive holds early instances of both, and they were used to derive further domains of relevance to my project. From these sources then, I compose an initial list of domains, or in fact several lists concerned with different issues. One limitation of this approach is that it tends to foreground those organisations which had trouble to register a domain, or at least a host on a domain, and the evidence suggests that a great many late 90s sites, both big and small, did not, and so it's clear that this method underestimates the size and density of the web sphere, if not its shape. The second stage was to interrogate web archives themselves in order to find both to find archived versions of these domains and to uncover further related ones. And the British Library makes available a dataset which serves this purpose, being the UK host link graph. It's derived from the JISC UK web domain dataset and extraction of the Internet Archive's holdings for the .uk ccTLD. Taking my list of domains, a set of scripts were created, one for each list, to extract from the UK host link graph all of the edges that represented either an inbound link to or an outbound link from one of the domains on the list. The resulting datasets were then manipulated to extract those domain names that had not previously been identified. These newly discovered domains were then individually assessed and categorized by means of both the live web, where applicable, and the Internet Archive. In some cases, a domain was a predecessor of that currently in use, and in these cases the association was recorded and the superseded domain added back into the master list. Visual inspection of other previously unknown archive sites also revealed numerous web rings, blog rolls, smaller directories, and pages of links like this one, from which further domains could be derived and fed back into the scripts. Revising the scripts each time, the process was repeated until no new relevant domains were being turned up by further iterations, and once this point was reached for each list, I combined the final datasets to produce a single graph for all the domains under examination, removed the duplicate lines, and dealt with another script with some of the noise. And by this means, it was possible to derive a link graph of the conservative Christian web in the UK in the earliest days of web archiving. With this graph, it's possible to begin to analyse the interrelations between campaigning groups on several different issues of religion, law, politics and ethics in the UK, and their relationships with the non-UK web and with political organisations, government, the media and other interested organisations. And this is not the venue for a full rehearsal of that analysis, which I intend to publish at length elsewhere. However, the method I've outlined, which is soon to be published, is one by which the boundary of a soft web sphere can be drawn by interrogation of a large link graph. It also demonstrates the kind of multi-source investigation that's necessary to uncover the archaeology of the early web. Big data and small, printed sources and echoes in the scholarly record itself, all these come into play when trying to understand an archive without a catalogue. Thank you very much.